For anyone who regularly engages with my content, you'll notice that I've posted a fair bit about RPL recently. And it seems to have started the exact conversations I intended. RPL is an area where we see some absolutely terrible practice, and the regulator sees this too. And we absolutely should be questioning the advice being given about it. Now, I was a senior leader in an RTO for a number of years. A very successful, very strategic RTO, might I add. And I understand how it feels to have external parties start talking to you about all the wonderful things they can do to help your business. And unfortunately, for many salespeople, I'm the kind of person that likes to do my homework. And this principle applies in everything I do. And if you don't know that I'm autistic already, you certainly will by the end of this video. So do your homework on me while I do my homework on RPL. Now, before we get into it, let me clarify why I'm able to talk about RPL. My experience with RPL began when I entered the vet sector 13 years ago. I completed a substantial part of my Cert 4 TAE through RPL, and that was based on my 2 education degrees and my teaching experience. I also received an RPL towards my Diploma of Management, and that was based on my previous work in enterprise risk management. Since then, I've assessed RPL applications, developed and reviewed RPL assessment systems, been assessed as an RPL candidate in various units of competency, supervised RPL processes, and consulted extensively with RTOs on their RPL approaches. More broadly, I've designed, delivered, and reviewed assessment across multiple training packages, led academic departments, held senior responsibility for training and assessment compliance and quality, and participated in multiple ASQA and funding audits. So when I talk about RPL, I'm drawing on 13 years of practical experience as a candidate, assessor, assessment designer, supervisor, consultant, and senior RTO leader. Now, that doesn't make everything I say automatically correct, but it does mean my ideas have been developed and tested through practice. So, now for my homework. So we're going to start by taking a look at what it says in the standards, the 2025 standards, and we're going to start with the definitions. Let me just scroll to the right spot. Okay, let's take a look at the definition of RPL, recognition of prior learning. Recognition of prior learning means an assessment process that involves assessment of an individual's relevant prior learning and experience, including skills and knowledge obtained through formal and informal learning, to determine the extent to which the individual meets requirements specified in the training product. So, RPL is a process of assessing what someone already knows and can do based on their previous learning and experience to determine how much of the training product's requirements they already meet. Cool. So now let's go further and check out the specific standard for RPL. And that standard is standard 1.6. So let's start off with taking a look at what the outcome standard statement actually says. Vet students with prior skills, knowledge, and competencies are supported to seek recognition of prior learning to progress through the relevant training product. And our performance indicators. So performance indicator A, vet students are offered opportunities to seek recognition of prior learning and are made aware of the organisation's policies for seeking recognition of prior learning. So essentially that means we need to make RPL available. B, decisions relating to recognition of prior learning are based on evidence of prior skills, learning and experience, and are undertaken in accordance with the organisation's assessment system. So in other words, RPL decisions must be based on evidence of what the person has previously learned and can do, and must follow the RTOs assessment system. Then performance indicators C, decisions relating to recognition of prior learning are documented and decided in a way that is fair, transparent, consistent amongst vet students, and maintains the integrity of the training product. So, RPL decisions must be properly documented and made fairly, openly, and consistently for all students without compromising the requirements of the training product. So there are two things we now need to look at to help us to understand this further. One, what's required of an RTO's assessment system. Two, the requirements of the training product. So let's start with what's required of an RTO's assessment system. And we're going to take a look again at what it says in the definitions in the legislative instrument. Okay, assessment system. Assessment system means a coordinated set of documented policies, procedures, and assessment tools designed to ensure that assessment, including recognition of prior learning, produces consistent and valid judgments of vet student competency and meets the requirements of this instrument. Okay, so now let's actually move to the standards that cover the assessment system, okay? So we're looking at Division 2 of Quality Area 1, Assessment. And we're going to start with Standard 1.3. So the outcome standard statement, the assessment system is fit for purpose and consistent with the training product. And our performance indicators, the assessment is consistent with the requirements of the training product. Assessment tools are reviewed prior to use to ensure assessment can be conducted in a way that is consistent with the principles of assessment and rules of evidence set out under Standard 1.4. And the outcomes of any such reviews inform any necessary changes to assessment tools. So, the RTO's assessment system must suit its intended purpose and align with the training product. Assessments must reflect the training product's requirements, and assessment tools must be reviewed before use to ensure that they support assessment that follows the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. And if that review identifies any issues, then the tools need to be changed to reflect that, okay? So now let's jump to Standard 1.4. So Standard 4 is the new Standard 1.8 for those of you that worked under the 2015 standards, and I'm sure we all loved being beaten over the head with 1.8. 1.4 is the new one we're going to keep being beaten over the head with if we don't get this right. So the outcome statement for Standard 1.4. The assessment system ensures assessment is conducted in a way that is fair and appropriate and enables accurate assessment judgment of vet student competency. And we've got two performance indicators. So performance indicator A, the assessment system facilitates assessment which must be conducted in accordance with the following principles. So we're dealing with our principles of assessment here. The first of these is fairness. So assessment accommodates the needs of the vet student including implementing reasonable adjustments where appropriate and enabling reassessment where necessary. Okay, pretty straightforward. Flexibility. Assessment is appropriate to the context, training product, and vet student, and assesses the vet student's skills and knowledge that are relevant to the training product, regardless of how or where the vet student has acquired those skills or that knowledge. Now, I want to pause for a moment on this one. Flexibility doesn't mean that the assessment can be separated from the training product. The assessment must be appropriate to three things, okay? The context, the individual student, and the training product, all three. And that explicit emphasis on the training product really matters. Regardless of how or where the student acquired their skills and knowledge, the assessment still needs to assess those skills and knowledge against the requirements of the training product. So let's move on to validity. Assessment includes practical application components that enable the vet student to demonstrate the relevant skills and knowledge in a practical setting. So this means assessment must include practical application components, and those practical application components need to allow the student to demonstrate the relevant skills and knowledge in a practical setting. And then we have reliability. Assessment evidence is interpreted consistently by assessors, and the outcomes of assessment are comparable irrespective of which assessor is conducting the assessment. So let's now move on to the rules of evidence. Okay, performance indicator B. Assessors make individual assessment judgments that are justified based on the following rules of evidence. So again, we have validity. Assessment evidence is adequate such that the assessor can be reasonably assured that the vet student possesses the skills and knowledge described in the training product. So this means that there must be enough appropriate evidence for the assessor to be reasonably confident that the student has the skills and the knowledge that are required in the training product, right? Again, the training product is the benchmark. The evidence isn't valid just because it demonstrates that the student's experienced or that they're capable in their role. It must demonstrate the particular skills and knowledge required by the training product. So we then have sufficiency. The quality, quantity, and relevance of the assessment evidence enables the assessor to make an informed judgment of the vet student's competency in the skills and knowledge described in the training product. So this means we have to have quality evidence, and by quality it means that it meets all of the necessary requirements. We have enough of that evidence, and that evidence is relevant. It actually tells us something in line with what is required from the training product. Without that, an assessor cannot make an informed judgment about the student's competency. That judgment must relate specifically to the skills and knowledge described in the training product, and therefore the assessment needs to relate specifically, the assessment evidence must relate specifically to the skills and knowledge described in the training product. So then we have authenticity. The assessor is assured that a vet student's assessment evidence is the original and genuine work of that vet student. Shouldn't need to explain that one. And currency. The assessment evidence presented to the assessor documents and demonstrates the vet student's current skills and knowledge, right? What are they able to do now? So, for anyone who's sitting there saying, but that's the assessment system, Catherine, we're talking about RPL. Let's go back to standard 1.6. Decisions related to recognition of prior learning are based on evidence of prior skills, learning, and experience, and are undertaken in accordance with the organisation's assessment system. So that means that RPL is also governed by the standards that govern the assessment system, and that includes standards 1.3 and 1.4. Now, before we get to the training product part, I actually want to take a look at what the ASQA practice guides say. So let's jump into the ASQA practice guide for RPL and credit transfer. And we're not going to worry about credit transfer. So that's a whole other can of worms. We're just going to focus on the RPL part. And we're going to look at the example activities and considerations for compliance under standard 1.6, okay? So you can demonstrate how your recognition of prior learning policies, processes, and tools are designed and applied with the same rigor as your assessment system, including that they are consistent with and maintain the integrity of the training product requirements, ensure currency of evidence provided by the vet student, meet the requirements of the principles of assessment and rules of evidence, standard 1.4, result in transparent, defensible, and documented decisions. You can demonstrate how you make students aware of their right to have their prior learning recognised, okay, unless it's prevented by industry regulator licensing requirements, and your organisation's RPL policy and process. You can demonstrate how your RPL approach accommodates the variety of experiences and learning pathways that students present. You can demonstrate how students are made aware of the role any third party will play in their RPL assessment. Now, I want to clarify what third party means here, and to do that, I'm going to use the definition that's in the legislative instrument, okay? Third party means any person who has an arrangement with an NVR registered training organisation to deliver services, but does not include employees of the organisation, experts engaged by the organisation, or government agencies and government-funded agencies that refer vet students to the organisation and do not receive any payment from the organisation for doing so. That is not a prac supervisor. So, the next one. You can demonstrate how you ensure that the assessor responsible for assessing the RPL evidence, including those engaged through third parties, meet the requirements of standards 3.2 and 3.3. You ensure that your staff understand that granting RPL where the student does not meet the requirements of the training product may have serious consequences for the vet student and for public safety, industry confidence, and the reputation of the vet sector, and can demonstrate to ASQA how your policies, systems, and processes provide this assurance. Remember that one. You can demonstrate how you validate and assure and assure your RPL practices and processes to be confident that decisions are being made in accordance with the standards. And where third parties conduct RPL on your RTO's behalf, you can demonstrate how you monitor and validate the quality of their RPL practices with the same level of rigour. And finally, where assessment of a vet student's RPL evidence identifies gaps, you can demonstrate how you work with them in relation to the amount of gap training required, how that training will be delivered, and any costs associated with it. And I will point out at that point, that means that the result is RPL not granted, and they actually are then being trained, because RPL is an assessment only pathway. You can still use the evidence that does meet the requirements of the unit, and it gives them partial competency, for want of a better term. But because they're actually going to need that gap training, the training in certain components of the unit of competency, it doesn't count as RPL anymore, because training is happening, and RPL is an assessment only pathway. Okay, so let's also take a look at the known risks to quality outcomes. Using inadequate assessment practices or business models that cut corners in issuing RPL, which can lead to persons without the expected competencies entering critical roles, including in industries with mandatory qualifications such as aged care, disability services, and early childhood education and care. We know this is a problem. Promoting RPL as an easy, quick, or guaranteed path to qualifications. Using RPL systems that do not apply the same rigour as the organisation's assessment system, including not upholding assessment record retention requirements, including not limited to. Making inadequate inquiries with students seeking RPL or agents seeking RPL on their behalf. For example, not being wary of non-genuine students that may be seeking RPL as a vehicle to facilitate other objectives. Failing to verify that RPL evidence submitted by students is authentic. Sorry, what? Outsourcing RPL assessments to unregulated third parties that do not understand or apply the standards to their practices. For example, using third parties that do not engage properly qualified or trained assessors. Failing to ensure RPL assessment practices are robust enough to meet the applicable threshold for high-risk work licensing where applicable. Failing to ensure that RPL evidence of overseas qualifications or competencies has been mapped to Australian legislative and regulatory requirements, for example, Australian work health and safety legislation or other industry-specific laws. Just because the person has demonstrated competency in another country's laws, in, for example, WHS, doesn't mean those laws are the same here, okay? It just means the words are the same. Failing to robustly assess or test RPL evidence for currency against training package requirements or against the rules of evidence. I'm going to highlight this one. Let's just sit with that for a second. Against training package requirements or against the rules of evidence. Automatically granting RPL for students that hold a higher AQF level qualification in the same industry. Having insufficient systems for identifying and addressing a student's RPL gaps. Now, because this practice guide references the assessment system, the principles of assessment, and the rules of evidence, let's also check out the ASQA practice guide for assessment. Now, For the purposes of this video, I'm not going to go through all of these because not all of them are relevant to the scope of this video, okay? But let me pick out the ones that are. So let's start with the relevant example activities and considerations for compliance under Standard 1.3. You can demonstrate that your assessment system addresses all requirements of the training product, determines what competence looks like based on the unit elements, performance criteria, and assessment requirements, contextualizes assessment tools to the student cohort and industry or work context, balances theory with practical assessment to ensure students undertake all required tasks and demonstrate their competence in different settings, enables consistent collection of valid and reliable evidence. You can demonstrate how you ensure assessment is fit for purpose and consistent with the requirements of the training product at an appropriate level of difficulty. You can demonstrate how you ensure currency of assessment so that it's in line with the training product and current industry practice. And then just jumping to this one, you can show how your assessment activities, so resources, methods, and timing, have considered the needs of your specific student cohort and context. Now, just jumping down to the known risks to quality outcomes, reliance on generic purchased assessment tools that are not contextualized to your student cohort, learning environment, and or training product requirements, generic templates or checklists to conduct the review of assessment tools prior to use, not conducting reviews on mandated assessment tools for licensed outcomes to ensure they meet the principles of assessment and rules of evidence. Okay. So let's jump into the relevant example activities and considerations for compliance in Standard 1.4. Okay. So let's actually start with here when we're looking at the principle of fairness. You can demonstrate how you apply the principle of fairness in assessment, for example, by considering students' needs and making reasonable adjustments to your assessment processes or tools, ensuring students are fully informed of the assessment process, considering whether they need further training before being reassessed. You can demonstrate how you apply the principle of flexibility in assessment, for example, by adjusting your assessment system where a student has already demonstrated some aspects of the unit of competency through other means, recognizing that students demonstrate competence in a variety of ways, drawing from a range of assessment methods to find those that are appropriate to your context, the assessment requirements, and the individual student. You can demonstrate how you apply the principle of validity of assessment. For example, assessment is based on evidence that demonstrates that a student could perform the skills and knowledge across a range of situations. Assessment of knowledge and skills is integrated with practical application. Skills are assessed by observing the student carrying out the relevant task in an appropriate environment. You can demonstrate how you apply the principle of reliability in assessment, for example, by having an assessment system that includes sufficient context, detail, and guidance to enable assessors to make consistent assessment judgments and minimizes variation between assessors, developing evidence criteria, i.e. decision-making rules, to judge the quality of performance, identifying benchmarks for practical activities that are broad enough to allow for variations in the task being undertaken and any variations in the context, but include sufficiently detailed observable behaviours. I'm going to highlight this one. Remember this one. Actively assuring assessment practices through monitoring the reliability and consistency of decisions by your assessors on an ongoing basis. You can demonstrate how you ensure validity in assessment judgments, For example, judgment of competence is based on a range of relevant evidence, ensuring there is a direct relationship between the assessment task or activity the student undertakes, including assessment of practical application of skills, the evidence presented by the student, and the assessment requirements, right? They need to actually link and be relevant. Jumping into the known risks here, using assessment tools that aren't contextualized to your student cohort and assessment system, making adjustments for a student to accommodate their needs or preferences that compromise the integrity of the training product, i.e., will not ensure that the student attains the required skills and knowledge specified in the assessment requirements. Remember that one. Undertaking assessment of students in a group environment where it's unlikely that each student is able to be properly assessed as competent. Not assessing students while on placement, particularly in qualifications where direct observation is required. Inadequate systems to ensure consistency in assessment judgments across assessors. Allowing people working under direction to make assessment decisions. Insufficient governance of academic integrity. Using generic tick box checklists to demonstrate a student has completed observational type or practical assessments. Not verifying that the individual completing the assessment is the student who will be issued with a qualification or statement of attainment. Neglecting to review your assessment systems after completed cohorts have provided feedback and therefore missing opportunities to continuously improve. Now, by this point, you're probably going, well, yeah, Catherine, we can read this ourselves. Yes, of course you can. But I'm going to be coming back to these as we explore the second part of our homework, understanding the training product requirements. And just to make sure that we have it right about what a training product is, let's go back to our legislative instrument and check the definition. Training product. Training product means an AQF qualification, a skill set, a unit of competency, accredited short course or module, okay? And let's be really pedantic and check those definitions too. And we'll do that in alphabetical order because you know that just makes sense. Accredited short course means a course that leads to a VET statement of attainment, accredited by a VET regulator in accordance with the standards for VET accredited courses or the equivalent requirements in a non-referring state. That's a lot of words. AQF qualification. Come on, highlight. Wonderful. AQF qualification means an Australian qualifications framework qualification type endorsed in a training package or accredited in a VET accredited course. Cool. Skill set is our next one. Skill set means a single unit of competency or a combination of units of competency from a training package which link to a licensing or regulatory requirement or a defined industry need. And then finally, we have unit of competency. Unit of competency means the specification of the standards of performance required in the workplace as defined in a training product. Wonderful. So now we've got that straight, let's take a look at the training product. So I'm going to check a couple of units of competency here so that we can understand what we mean by the requirements of the training product. So essentially, what we need to assess. So I'm going to start with an example that I've used in some of my other content on RPL, and that is BSB TWK 503 managed meetings. Now, I'm not going to go through every single requirement here. I would if I was actually determining RPL requirements, but I'm sure you haven't got all day, right? So let's start by taking a brief look at the elements. for this unit. So remember, the elements are the essential outcomes. So what the learner is able to do upon successful completion of the unit. So here we have prepare for meetings, conduct meetings, and follow-up meetings. Now I just want to focus on element 2, conduct meetings, just for the purpose of this video. So let's now jump to the performance criteria. So these are the things that we need to assess, right? The performance criteria, the performance needed to demonstrate achievement of the element, okay? So 2.1, chair meetings according to organisational requirements, agreed conventions for type of meeting, and legal and ethical requirements. 2.2, promote participation, discussion, problem solving, and resolution of issues. And 2.3, brief minute taker on method for recording meeting notes. Now, I want us to think about the foundation skills required here. So foundation skills are the key to working out how we should be assessing our students in line with the principles of assessment and the requirements of the training product. So 2.1, chair meetings, right? Most definitely oral communication required here, some interaction, as well as reading because we have organisational requirements, etc. Okay. 2.2, promote participation, discussion, problem solving, and resolution of issues. Again, oral communication. And 2.3, brief minute taker on method for recording meeting notes. Now, I've conducted a silly amount of meetings in my time, and I've also been the minute taker for far more than I care to remember. And yes, the most common and effective way of doing this is via oral communication. So the training product is telling us that we must assess through oral communication here. And as we scroll down to the foundation skills section, we do have specifics on oral communication. Now, units don't always do this, which is why we still need to determine the foundation skills in the performance criteria ourselves. But let's take a look at what it says. Participates in verbal exchanges using appropriate style, tone, and vocabulary for audience, context, and purpose. Listens for specific information during meetings. Asks questions and listens to responses to clarify understanding. Okay, our assessment tool must address this. So now let's take a look at the assessment requirements and jump to the performance evidence. The candidate must demonstrate the ability to complete the tasks outlined in the elements, performance criteria, and foundation skills of this unit, including evidence of the ability to manage a meeting on at least 2 occasions. In the course of the above, the candidate must apply conventions and procedures for meetings, including blah, 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 including conducting a meeting, follow relevant organisational policies and procedures. How do we assess someone managing a meeting and demonstrating those oral communication and interaction skills? We observe them, right? Non-negotiable, right? It's not a reasonable adjustment to change this requirement. So if it wouldn't be okay under reasonable adjustment, why would it be okay? Why would it be reasonable in RPL? Can we get a third-party report for this? No. 1.4b, rules of evidence. How on earth can the assessor be reasonably assured that the candidate has these skills from a third-party report? And also, while we're at it, competency conversations. If ever there was a term that indicated a lack of understanding of assessment and RPL, it's competency conversation. How can you determine competency through a conversation when the training product specifies that we need demonstrated evidence that the student can do something? I can explain the mechanics of how to fly. Does that mean I can competently spread my wings and beat the rush hour traffic? I wish. Let's continue. Let's take a look at the assessment conditions. Skills in this unit must be demonstrated in a workplace or simulated environment where the conditions are typical of those working in an environment in this industry. This includes access to organisational policies and procedures for managing meetings, computers and relevant software, and then we've got our usual spiel about assessor requirements. Demonstrated, not talked about, not written about, demonstrated. So our regular in class, and I'm using in class because that's a term that a lot of people use. And sorry, why are we assessing students in class time when they should be learning? See standard 1.1. So our regular in class assessments must meet this criteria, right? Now, in this situation, we might set up a simulation because that's usually the most effective way of doing this in a BSB course that doesn't have a prac, right? However, if your cohort is being trained in the workplace, you might do those observations on real meetings. Same observation assessment tool though, right? It's just being used in a different context. Now, if the regular assessment meets those conditions, why can't we use the same tool to collect RPL evidence? Reasonable adjustment allows for this. We follow the same principles of reasonable adjustment in RPL processes. If it wouldn't be reasonable for a regular student, why is it reasonable for an RPL candidate? Now, I want to draw your attention back to one of the examples used in the assessment practice guide. So let me jump back into that. Let me check identifying benchmarks. Here we go. Identifying benchmarks for practical activities that are broad enough to allow for variations in the task being undertaken and any variations in the context, but include sufficiently detailed observable behaviours. Okay? That's the key. A robust assessment tool to begin with. A quality assessment tool can be applied in a range of contexts, and that includes RPL. Now, we've looked at a pretty low risk unit, but I do want to take a look at a higher risk one. So I'm going to take a look at some of the components of CHC ECE 031, Support Children's Health, Safety and Wellbeing, which is a core unit in the Certificate 3 Early Childhood Education and Care. Now, to start off with, I do want to draw your attention to the applications section because I appreciate that not everyone has an in-depth knowledge of working with children like I do. So, this unit describes the performance outcomes, skills, and knowledge to support and promote children's health, safety, and well-being in relation to physical activity, healthy eating, sleep, rest and relaxation, and individual medical requirements. So if we weren't sure about whether or not this unit was high risk, I think that tells us, okay? The unit applies to educators who work according to established policies and procedures and under the guidance of others in regulated children's education and care services in Australia. And then we've got the usual spiel about legislation and licensing and whatnot. Now, again, you haven't got all day, so I am just going to focus on specific parts of this training product. And I'm actually going to choose an area that is very often a non-compliance reported by ASQA, the governing body in childcare, right? And that is element 6, supervised children. So remember, the element supervised children is an essential outcome of the unit. So let's take a look at the performance criteria, right? The performance needed to demonstrate achievement of the element. So 6.1, follow regulations and implement service policies and procedures for active supervision of children. 6.2, use positive, developmentally appropriate communication when informing children of safety requirements. 6.3, adjust levels of supervision depending upon the area of the service and the skill, age mix, dynamics, and size of the group of children, and the level of risk involved in activities and play. 6.4, exchange information about supervision with colleagues to ensure adequate supervision at all times. So let's consider the foundation skills here so that we can determine how we should be assessing our learners here. So 6.1, follow regulations, implement service policies and procedures, right? Yes, there's reading here because we're dealing with policies and procedures, but we're following these to actively supervise children. Now, I've supervised many children in my time, and I can tell you that that involves a lot of oral communication and interaction. 6.2, use positive, developmentally appropriate communication when informing children of safety requirements, okay? When you're dealing with children who are only just learning to talk, that's definitely not a writing exercise. 6.3, adjust levels of supervision depending on various things. That's an application of health and safety knowledge, right? And it's all well and good rattling off things like supervision ratios, but can they actually implement that in practice? And there's a lot of oral communication involved in that and interaction. And then 6.4, exchange information about supervision with colleagues to ensure adequate supervision at all times, okay? Again, this is something that's done orally. It's communication between educators as you're supervising children, okay? So this must be assessed through oral communication and interaction with real people and real children, right? I'm sorry, you cannot assess someone's competence in this, in supervising children without seeing them supervising real children, okay? Now, on the foundation skills note, we do have some specifics in terms of oral communication. So oral communication skills 2, interact and engage with children to build rapport, okay? So oral communication is there. So now for the assessment requirements. So there's quite a bit of this that isn't relevant to the specific focus area, but this bit is. Demonstrate the principles of active supervision to supervise one group of children for a complete activity or play period according to service procedures. Okay, we have to watch them do this. It's the only way to be able to assess someone's ability to do that. And just a note here, perform the activities outlined in the performance criteria of this unit during a period of at least 160 hours of work in a regulated children's education and care service in Australia. Now remember, the performance criteria sit under the elements. So the performance criteria that sit under supervised children need to be performed in a childcare service in Australia, okay? So let's jump into the assessment conditions, okay? Skills must be demonstrated in a regulated children's education and care service in Australia, okay? We must be assessing our students in the workplace. It's just been reiterated again. Some of this isn't relevant. It does say that there are some specific parts of the performance evidence that must be observed directly by the assessor on at least one occasion. Remaining performance evidence may be collected through authenticated third-party reports. Now, this isn't your get-out-of-jail-free card for not being out in the workplace. It does say may. You need to be making a professional judgment as to whether that is actually the right evidence, right? That evidence that you're collecting meets the rules of evidence. Observation and third-party reports must be supplemented by other forms of evidence anyway. Interactions with children must be supervised by an approved early childhood educator. So any interactions that are happening are being supervised anyway. Now, it does talk about here that, there are some exceptions for the tasks that involve toileting or undressing, because there are some childcare services that don't allow this for students, okay? But that's not relevant to the scope of what we're talking about at the moment in terms of supervising children. But this is skills relating to responding to situations where the health and safety of children may be compromised, may be demonstrated through simulated activities and scenarios. Again, this is not your get out of jail free card, because the students would not be supervising those children on their own, right? Because they're not qualified to yet. So, how would I assess this? I would be going out into the childcare service, observing the student during an activity, and I would say to that student, I want you to imagine that the person or the people who are actually supervising, or this person here, they're not here and you're in their role. And I want you to show me what you would do, and I want you to talk me through it. I want to listen to the communication that you would be having with other educators, etc. Okay? Children are not being put at risk there because other people are already supervising them. Simulated assessment environments must simulate the real-life working environment where the skills and knowledge within this unit would be utilised with all the relevant equipment and resources of that working environment. Okay, so really, really hard to set up a simulated environment supervising children, right? Adults pretending to be children, no, I'm sorry, that does not reflect the real life working environment. It doesn't. Okay? We've got a list of things that assessment must ensure access to. So things that might be applicable here in terms of the supervision. It might be sun protection materials, toys and other play equipment. We see the regulations, etc., etc. Children in a regulated education and care service in Australia. Okay? This component of this unit, you need to be able to see the candidate supervising children. Okay? Even if they're not the real supervisor, they're demonstrating they can supervise the children. Okay? Now, I do want to go back to something from one of the practice guides here, okay? So I want to jump back into the RPL guide, and I want to go to this. You ensure that your staff understand that granting RPL where the student does not meet the requirements of the training product may have serious consequences for the vet student and for public safety, industry confidence, and the reputation of the vet sector, and can demonstrate to ASQA how your policies, systems, and processes provide this assurance. And then also, in terms of the known risks to quality outcomes, using inadequate assessment practices or business models that cut corners in issuing RPL, which can lead to persons without the expected competencies entering critical roles, including in industries with mandatory qualifications such as early childhood education and care. How can you be reasonably assured as an assessor that someone can supervise children without seeing them supervise children? Talking about supervising children isn't even in the same postcode as actually doing it. And what are the impacts of not being able to supervise children competently? We're talking about children as young as 3 months old, right? Just sit with that for a second. So let's tie this all together now. RPL is an assessment process. It must be conducted through the RTOs assessment system with the same rigour as any other assessment, and it must assess the candidate against the requirements of the training product. The training product doesn't change because the person developed their skills through work or life experience rather than through formal training. If the training product requires a skill to be demonstrated, the RPL candidate must demonstrate it. If it requires assessment in a particular environment, the RPL assessment must occur in that environment. A collection of documents, a third-party report, or God forbid, a competency conversation cannot replace direct assessment of practical performance where the training product requires it. This is why I question the assumption that RPL automatically requires a separate suite of assessment tools. Now, I'm not saying that an RTO can't develop tools specifically for RPL, or that the process should look identical for every candidate. The assessment process shouldn't look identical for every candidate, right? And that includes RPL. RPL must accommodate the person's prior experience and the evidence they already have, but any tool must still be fit for purpose, meet the principles of assessment and rules of evidence, and collect the evidence required by the training product. If your existing assessment tool already does that and can be used appropriately in the candidate's context, why would you need to replace it with a special RPL version? The distinction isn't between normal assessment and RPL assessment. The distinction is how the person developed the skills and knowledge being assessed. One student develops them through your training. The other says they already have them. In both cases, the assessor must establish whether the individual meets the same requirements to the same standard. And this brings me to the bigger issue. We have a problem with RPL because we have a problem with assessment. If assessors don't know how to interpret a training product, to determine what evidence is required, and to select an appropriate assessment method, creating a separate RPL kit won't solve that problem. In fact, it's probably going to disguise it or make it worse. When RPL is treated as a specialist administrative process rather than assessment, the focus shifts towards collecting paperwork and completing templates instead of making a valid judgment about competency. The real question isn't whether someone's completed an RPL kit or produced a large portfolio of evidence. The question is whether the assessor has enough valid, sufficient, authentic, and current evidence to be reasonably assured that this individual meets the requirements of the training product. That is what the legislation says, it's what ASQA's guidance reinforces, and what protects the integrity of the qualification, the industries that rely on it, and the people those industries serve. So, when someone presents themselves as an RPL expert, absolutely do your homework, including when that person's me. Look beyond titles and marketing and awards and claims of experience. Consider whether their advice is grounded in the 2025 standards, the principles of assessment, the rules of evidence, and most importantly, the requirements of the training product. Expertise should never replace someone's ideas beyond scrutiny. It should mean that those ideas can withstand that scrutiny.